Following our first session, we now come to the second one, and the title is Know People. So once you know yourself, which is a step forward in church planting, we mustn't forget that we're called to know the people we are serving. In fact, one of the points that really, I think, struck many of us is the fact that we're serving God. And therefore, with that thought in mind, we're not serving people for gain, but we are serving Him, and therefore we serve others. And so, in the light of that, we want to jump into this. In the context of church planting, it's very important to think through how well or how much we know people. So this was the little presentation that was done. If the Christian life is the art of loving God and loving others, then we can only love others if we know them. Paul's letters overflow with his deep love for and knowledge of others, and this was key to his success as a church planter. 1 Corinthians 9 is key, but so many other passages. Church planting brings us into contact with other people in a dramatic, intense way. It was interesting listening to many of you last night in terms of church planting projects and vision. And I love thinking things through in a methodical way and creating systems and plans. I have documents over the past 35 years of thinking things through, planning projects. I've got kind of all sorts of projects stashed away which have never gone anywhere. But obviously, church planting is not just a plan or a project. Let's not forget that it has to do with something very specific. So church planting has to do with people, and there's no way around that. You can't think of church or church planting as an institutionalized project or program. It's about people. And so the thing that, I don't know about you, but that I've discovered over many years, my father was a missionary pastor of a church. My grandfather was a pastor in the UK for many years. So I've come from I'm a third generation pastor and planter. But what I've discovered is that, I don't know about your experience, but you do not always get to choose the people you want. In other words, our churches very often are full of messiness because I'm messy, but so is everybody else. Now, in football, you have what in Italy we call calciomercato, which is the market of football players. And so you essentially choose the players you want, you buy them, and then you get shot of the players that you don't want. I've thought of introducing that as an app for church planting, but you can't exactly do it. And so you don't choose the people, but you get what you get. And it can sound very negative, but you have what you have. So I often say to my wife, this is what we have. So I don't want to be fatalistic, but it's about the people that we are in contact with, or the people that we come in contact with, despite having hoped that we'd have something different. But it's all about the Great Commission. At the end of the day, what Jesus said is what we need to do. So when we're thinking about Acts, where we're really honing in these sessions, we're thinking about response to the Great Commission, and that is making disciples. That's the heart of church planting. Now, I know that it would be interesting to have different ideas and definitions about church planting and discipleship and evangelism and mission and how those things intersect. That would really be interesting. But essentially, church planting occurs where evangelism occurs, which then produces healthy discipleship, and then produces a church which grows and then multiplies and replicates. So I thought I would give you a few of the definitions by a few people. So this is one by Matt Chandler. And I say it would be interesting to get different opinions, because I know that there's no one set kind of inspired definition, but I found two that I thought were helpful. Discipleship is the process of devoting oneself to a teacher to learn from and becoming more like him or like them. And so I thought that was helpful, because that's what discipleship is. It's this process. So again, in our context, you sometimes talk about discipleship as a course. So I've been discipled. But there is a sense in which, I understand where that's coming from. But it is a process. It's an ongoing process in which you are being transformed to the teacher that you're learning from. Of course, we're not trying to create disciples, clones of me. At least if you're trying to do that, I would suggest you rethink your strategy. Because what we're doing is we're trying to make disciples of Jesus. That's the ultimate aim. So this may be a slightly more kind of Fuller, if you like, but this is another unknown author, John Piper. But he essentially said, I think what is important is not the terminology. So we could get lost in what do you think discipleship is, and probably we'd all have something to offer to a good definition. But it's the reality of what we're talking about. People need to become Christians, and that's making disciples. And people need to be taught how to think and feel and act as a Christian. So again, you could take that word taught, and you could put in, they need to be walked with. That's another way of looking at it as well. It's a process kind of concept. And then he says a bit later on, it's a fresh concern. So discipleship is a fresh concern about how to bring people to Christ and grow them up into being what they ought to be as Christians or as followers of Jesus or as disciples. So again, it's a fairly full definition, which you can agree with or disagree with. I'm not really too interested at this point. But the idea is that as we are church planting, we must be thinking disciples. As we're church planting, we must be thinking discipleship. We mustn't just kind of be happy to do a blitz with an activity or a special event and then say, 100 people accepted Christ and that's it. It's about disciples. It's about discipleship. And so that is a very important point of departure, because it affects how we look at healthy church planting. Because for some, healthy church planting or successful church planting is a numbers game. It's a kind of very jam-packed series of events and activities where people come and we think we're doing church planting. But potentially, I hope that after this session this morning, if you're thinking that way, you will actually think again. And somebody said last night, I think very helpful, and in fact, different people said the same thing. What we need is a discipleship DNA. And I like that. I like that concept of a DNA within our churches. And let me put that a little more contextual to what we're trying to say. We need a discipleship DNA in our church plants. So when you're starting from scratch, because I don't know about your experience, but one thing is to start from zero and you build. Another thing is to start from something that's out there, an established church, maybe with a long history. With a mindset, or people who've got a lot of experience, and if they don't have the discipleship DNA, it's very complicated. Before we go and look further into Acts, I do want to say that there is a supreme example of the discipler. There's a supreme example of a person who actually lives knowing people, and that is Jesus. And I haven't written this on the presentation, but Jesus and people. I wanted to start there. Before you go look at Paul and people, I wanted to kind of remind you, nothing new, I hope, for some of you, for most of you, but certainly Jesus and the people. First thing, Jesus knows the heart of people. If you want to take a note, Matthew chapter 12, verse 25. He knew their thoughts. It's very kind of personal, very deep. He knows individuals. Remember the example of Nathanael in John chapter 1, verse 47. There was something that Jesus, he was interested in the person. He knew the person. He saw the person. He didn't just see the kind of the project, I need to make disciples, but there was Nathanael. It was a person with a name. He takes interest in individuals. He invites people to come to him. He gives individuals rest. He gives individuals transformation. He is the good shepherd. He knows his sheep, and he calls them by name. They're individuals. They're people. They're one person at a time. He has compassion. Think of Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. When he saw the crowds, when he saw the cities of Europe, and he saw them as they were, as a sheep without a shepherd. These were not just random projects. These were individuals, and he had compassion on them. And then he calls individuals and spends time with them. I think of Zacchaeus, that story that we know well. Again, an individual who had a bad story, had a bad context, and yet he calls individuals and spends time with them. He goes and spends time eating with them and in their house, and he gets to know them and he's relating to them. And again, his message, the good news, is always at the center of the relationships with people around. And so he cares for the whole person. In fact, it's interesting, when Jairus' daughter is brought back to life in Luke chapter 8, verse 55, after she comes back, it's immediate that Jesus says to her, feed her, give her some food. He's not just thinking of the spirit, and he's interested in the whole of the person. He goes and heals. And he meets people, individuals, and responds to them in their need. So having said that, I want to now go on to the next point, which is we're going to look at three particular contexts, or some particular context, not three particular contexts. We're going to look at something that happened in the city of Philippi, And we're going to start by saying that mission does not start with the name of a city, but the name of a person. So again, we're thinking church planting. So you're thinking, okay, church planting, how do I do it? What does it mean? So it starts with who you are. It starts with yourself. We'll kind of dig into that a little more now. But it's also about knowing the people. It's about knowing where you're planting a church. Who are the people that you're engaging with? And so here's some examples from Acts chapter 16. And here is in the city of Philippi. There's some specific individuals. And again, this is a very simple process. But as you think about this, as you exegete Scripture in your context of church planting, I hope that this will be helpful for you. And there's nothing better than meeting somebody who maybe you met 30 or 40 years ago and still remembers you by name. I have a hard time with names. I often encounter people and they say, do you remember me? And I, kind of not, vaguely, but I have no idea of their names. George Verwer, Operation Mobilization kind of founder, an incredible man. I over the years, I've seen him different times. He has an incredible memory. And there's nothing more encouraging than meeting somebody that you've kind of known occasionally, and that person knows you by name. It's like a feeling of value. And in a sense, I think we've got to come back to the fact that church planting is about individuals. It's not hitting the city or reaching the villages. It's about the individuals in those cities and in those villages. I know it's something obvious, but doesn't it go beyond us so easily? We think of we're planting a church, kind of a bit anonymous out there. But thinking church planting is thinking people, individuals into whom you pour your life. So the first example is the example of Lydia. So Lydia is this, Acts chapter 16, verse 14. She's this woman from Thyatira. She's a well-to-do woman. Thyatira was famous for expensive purple dyes. And she presumably is a woman who's got a certain amount of wealth. But in chapter 16 of Acts, we find that Paul goes down to the river, and it says in verse 13, on the Sabbath day we went outside the gate to the riverside, where we supposed there was a place of prayer, and we sat down and spoke to the women who had come together. One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods, who was a worshiper of God. So here's a specific person in a specific place, and this is the key. The key is the Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. There was a certain amount of journey that God had already done in her life. So we could say that God was already at work before she met Paul, because she was already somebody who was a worshiper of God. There was something that was happening in her, but at that crucial moment of revelation, and remember, salvation comes from the Lord. And at that point, really, God opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul. She immediately, evidently received the message because she was baptized, verse 15 tells us that. And there's this gospel transformation. So here's an individual. She's a well-to-do lady. She's in a particular context with a group of women. And God opens her heart, and what happens is gospel transformation. So an individual who gets changed. And so there's this baptism as an expression of that change. And then it says, and her household as well. So there's a change which occurs in her, but also her household. So if you want to read between the lines, I know it's always a dangerous thing, but it's always a useful habit. There must have been some kind of contact between her and her household, or between Paul and the household. But there's a sense of Lydia being a key to enter into a different context. An individual. We often think big projects, church planting, we'll do something on social media or kind of big publicity, which is fine. But it's about an individual. It's about an individual who then unlocks a whole context. And so she was baptized with her household. And then it says, she urged us, saying, if you've judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. And it says in my translation, she prevailed upon us. That's the kind of Southern European hospitality that you can't refuse. Because there's good food and, they kind of insist and insist and insist. In fact, you have to say no 3 times at least. Otherwise, you're bad-mannered. But the idea is that she was a woman who evidently had this transformation. She'd found something, and there was something deep that she'd encountered. And by God's grace, she'd found the gospel. So here's a specific woman in a particular context. Then the second example is the slave girl. And the slave girl in the passage that follows, In fact, going further on in the passage, verse 16, as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune-telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to you the way of salvation." And this she kept doing for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, or frustrated, or irritated, there's a whole kind of sequence of words there which we could use, turned and said to the Spirit, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out at that very hour. Now, we don't know the name of this slave girl. We know that she was a slave girl. She was doing a job for the gain of others. She was, in a sense, a victim of human trafficking, in a sense. She was doing something which benefited others. She was doing something which was not the best job, and yet she was a human being. Now, it's very different. First, it's a kind of a well-to-do lady who's kind of well off and who's a merchant and a business lady and, has got a household and she can host people, and that's maybe the kind of person I would like in a church plant. I would like Lydia's, people who are already on the way and their hearts are opened up and there's radical gospel transformation immediately. They get baptized, their household believes, and then they invite me to a meal. That's great. That's the kind of church plant that I like. But here this is different, because this is a slave girl. We don't know her name. And all we know is that she is doing something which is not really good. In fact, Paul is annoyed, grieved by what she says. And he confronts the spirit in the slave girl. And again, gospel transformation. Because Paul has authority in the name of Jesus over evil spirits. And there is freedom. In other words, here is an individual that's very different from Lydia. But again, it's a person that Paul, instead of just saying, "I'm annoyed by you, go away," which is an instinctive reaction in many of our church plants, "You're more trouble than you're worth. Can you give me some Lydias, please? Slave girls with divination. Let's get some normal people. Let's get some rich, well-to-do, employed people who are going to stay in Palermo, not going to migrate and go to America. Give us some normal people." And yet, you don't get to choose what you get. And so this girl becomes a disciple. She becomes transformed. She becomes somebody in whom God is working. And then the third example is the example of the jailer. Again, this chapter 16 has got specific examples of people. You need to know your people. You need to enter into a relationship with them. You need to have a contact with individuals, not just the big project. So the jailer, in verse 23, it says that after this miracle of liberation of the slave girl, that the apostles were put into prison. And then verse 23, "And when they'd inflicted many blows upon them, they threw them into the prison, ordering the jailer to keep them safely. Having received this order, he, the jailer, put them into the inner prison and fastened their feet in the stocks," which is an extreme form of torture. It wasn't just as we think, poor guys, they got into prison. They had air conditioning and a color TV and internet. No, this was kind of old-fashioned prison. They were put into prison in the deepest, most innermost part, and then their feet were put into stocks. It was like they had to have their legs up straight and extended, and it was a big, big suffering. And it was the jailer who was like the perpetrator and the one who inflicted this torture on them. And so here's a person, again, if I was Paul, I'd say, "Hey man, the last person I want to minister to is the jailer. After all the harm that he's done." And what happens is, the story, we haven't got time to read it, but there's this earthquake, and then verse 27, the jailer is desperate. He's kind of, "What do I do now?" Because his whole security, identity is just kind of gone. And so what do I do now? And he's desperate. And he asks the best question ever, which I long for in church planting. I long for in the camps and in the evangelistic activities that we all do. "Sirs," I like that because that's polite, "what must I do to be saved?" Wouldn't you like that tomorrow when you go back, or on Friday when you go back to your city, your context? Meet people and they meet you and then they say, "What must I do to be saved?" That would be a tremendous question. But and so this jailer, who's in a situation of great need and who sees his world collapsing, again, a real person. In a sense, he's the enemy of Paul. He's different from Lydia, who's a well-to-do merchant. He's different from the slave girl, who, again, poor thing, is a victim. This is he's a victim because he's working for the state and he's doing a job. But this is a man who's actually inflicting torture on him. And yet, again, gospel transformation. Because Paul immediately, with clarity, I mean, what is the gospel? That's one of the most important questions. And here you have a synthesized version of it. Believe in the Lord Jesus and you will be saved, and your house. Now we kind of take that verse and we kind of quote it as though it was like the complete picture of the gospel. What must I do to be saved? Believe in the Lord Jesus and be saved, which is true. But never forget that that verse is followed by verse 32, and they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. This wasn't sign your name on a dotted line and accept Jesus and that's it. Believe in Jesus. Do you believe in Jesus? Yeah, I believe in Jesus. That's fine. Go away. This was believe in Jesus. Okay, here's the word of the Lord. This is what it means. And I read into that. Again, maybe I'm not very kind of doing right in this, but I read into it that there's a lot of clarity in what it means to follow Jesus, in what it means to experience salvation. It's a very clear presentation. It's a very clear idea. And so there's a sense of the jailer who has gospel transformation. Because then what happens? Not only does he believe, but he takes them in. Verse 33, notice the change. He took them the same hour of the night and washed their wounds. So here's the jailer. He tortured them. Now he takes them in and he heals them in a sense. And he was baptized at once, he and all of his family. Then he brought them up into his house. So again, these are details, but they're fabulous, aren't they? This tremendous radical change from the torturer to the brother, from down in the depths of the prison, and they're treated badly, and then they're taken into the house of this man. And he set food before them. I love this. It's so Mediterranean. He set food before them. That's one of the basic principles of church planting. It's all about food. And he rejoiced along with his entire household that he had believed in God. So 3 very diverse stories, but the sense is these are individuals. These are people that God brought before Paul's path, or on Paul's path. And maybe we would have disregarded one more than another. And yet here's a very important principle, and the principle is this, that church planting is about diversity. It's very easy to target one particular group, but that doesn't mean that God is of the same opinion. And I give one example. When I was in my early 20s, I was working in a Christian radio station down in Sicily, which I was managing. And back then, I did some fairly out-of-the-box radio programs. And in my mind, because when you communicate on the radio, you've got to think of your audience. This is one thing. This is an audience. I see you. But on the radio, no. You have a microphone in front of you. You have to imagine that you're talking to somebody specific. You have to kind of be very detailed. So in my mind, there was 15-year-olds, mostly girls. I don't know why. Maybe because I was in my early 20s. But anyhow, it was 15-year-olds sitting on a beach. That was my kind of target. So I was trying to. So that meant that my choice of music, and this is back in the late 70s, early 80s. We didn't have much to choose from, but it was fun. And so I was trying to think, how can I kind of communicate to them? So it was all very edgy, cutting edge, out of the box. It was Christian comedy sometimes, not very Christian, but a lot of comedy. And so I was targeting, and then my most faithful listener was an 80 years old, who was blind. And it's like, but I'm targeting something else. I want, 15-year-old teenagers who are sitting on a beach. So there is that sense in which we must learn to not kind of select particular people and then despise others. Now, I know that you don't do it maybe intentionally, despising others, but when there's a choice between a Lydia and a jailer, maybe instinctively we think, oh, well, let's invest more time. Let's spend more time. Now, it's important in church planting to remember that you might target, but God brings his own. Never forget that. And that's one of the wonderful things about having a strong theological background in church planting. You don't go crazy because you know that salvation comes from the Lord. So that doesn't mean, oh, therefore I don't do anything. It's just the opposite. It's because salvation comes from the Lord that you can kind of let go, let loose, because you know that you're working for the one who is actually in the business of saving. So don't despise what God has given you, and don't despair because of who they are. But get to know them. Realize that these are individuals, and don't write them off. Now, much more could be said in the context of know your people. And I would have liked to be very practical with you, and maybe in the discussions afterwards. But how do you get to know a person? What does it mean to know a person? What are some of the ways in which we can get to know a person? What does it take? Because it's about not just speaking, but also listening. It's creating opportunities. Again, maybe eating together, doing life on life, as some of us often say. So having said that, I want to go quickly on to the next point, which is this. It's about knowing yourself. Now, already Philip this morning has spoken somewhat about this, but I want to go into this a little more, because when you know people, when you want to understand who the people are, it's very important that first of all we understand who we are. So a little of this will be a little bit of kind of repetition, but one of the issues in church planting is identity. In other words, who am I? Before reaching others, before knowing people, that's what came out this morning of the session, we need to know who we are. What is it that really gives me a sense of identity and value? And you have to really understand what's the motivation deep down. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, there are a few points that I want to bring out in the remaining minutes. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, this is a long passage, but I'm going to try and simplify it. But essentially, before we know others, we need to actually do business with ourselves. We need to know who we are. Now, Paul, in writing to the Corinthians, in the first 19 verses, he knows what counts. He knows what makes him the way he is. He knows that he is redefined in his identity. He knows that he might have some rights. If you read through that whole passage, he has a lot of rights, but he decides, for the sake of the gospel, to renounce to the things which are his, because his identity is not defined by his rights. His identity is defined by the gospel of Jesus. And so he's free to give up things that are his by right. And what counts most? It's certainly, without doubt, it's the centrality of the gospel. And not in any way putting an obstacle in the path of those who are about to come to the gospel. In other words, he doesn't want to do anything. It says in verse 12, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. So try and apply that to your own situation. You and the people around, your neighbors, your co-workers, your friends, your enemies, the people around in your neighborhood, the people who come occasionally to your church. Do you have that sense of enduring anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Jesus? So he knows who he is. And if you read Philippians chapter 3, you will read there that although Paul has pedigree, he's a Jew, he's a Pharisee, he's got it all, but his identity is redefined, and it's redefined by who Jesus is. And it's redefined by the centrality of the gospel. It's all the gospel for Paul. He preaches Christ crucified, doesn't want anything else. And that's why then he goes on his missionary journeys and he suffers all kinds of stuff. Why? Because identity is defined by what he believes. But not just that. It's also important to think that we are called to know those who are like us. Now, here we come to this passage in 1 Corinthians 9, chapter 9, verse 19. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. And then it says in verse 20, to the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. Now that might sound a strange statement, because he is a Jew. And instead here it says, to the Jews I became as a Jew. Have you noticed that? I became as a Jew, but he is a Jew. No, he's not. He's no longer a Jew, he's a Christian. He's a disciple of Jesus. He's embarked on a process of change and redefinition. And so he is able to describe himself as somebody who is in a different category, in a different world, he's defined by different things. But having said that, he understands and remembers totally who he was. So he remembers that he's a Jew, he remembers that he was a Pharisee, and so because of that, he can identify with people, because he's not a kind of a closed into a ghetto kind of Christian. You know that kind of attitude? Where you close the door of the church, and then occasionally you go and blitz the world and blitz the unreached. But meanwhile, you're kind of in a rarefied ghetto context. And yet Paul, he identifies with people because he knows that he was like them, those like him, those who are Jews, as he was a Jew. And he becomes a Jew with them again to reach them with the gospel. So he identifies with them. He empathizes with them. And then, obviously, he has the skill set to communicate, to share, to preach the gospel to the Jews in a way which is relevant and contextual to them. I mean, he knows the way they think. He knows the people he's trying to reach. When he talks to the Jews, he knows what they're doing and how they think and how they react, because he was one of them. But he doesn't take a superior air. Oh, you poor guys, I was like you in the past, and but he does everything he can to go and reach them with the gospel. And he knows that they are quite close to him because he was like them. And so they are like him, those like you. But then also it's those unlike you. And again the verse continues, to those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law. Again, these are the Jews, that I might win those under law. That's the definition of his outreach to the Jews. Then it says, verse 21, to those outside the law, who are Gentiles, they're not Jews, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. So it's interesting how he knows people who think like him, because he knows where they're coming from, but he also relates to people who don't think like him, who are different to him. He goes towards those who are different to win them. He doesn't say, well, I can only understand the mindset of the Jew, then I'll just go to them. But there is that sense in which I will go to those who are different from me. So he then becomes as one outside the law. He wants to win the weak. He wants to win those who don't necessarily see the way he is. This is his objective. His objective in knowing other people is understanding who they are. Tomorrow we'll be talking about context. Understanding the context so that he can effectively reach out to those who he's trying to reach. So this idea of those unlike you is important, because as I encounter the contemporary European, increasingly I have to do with somebody who's way beyond where I'm coming from. If you look at the statistics, most recent statistics, the decline in belief of God, and even where people believe in God, it's not the God that you and I believe in. And so we're engaging in a completely different world, in a completely different language, and often we don't know the people that we're engaging with. We don't understand who they are or how they think or where they're coming from. And so as Paul became one of those without the law, we need to go towards them and become as them. In other words, we don't have to compromise, but we become as them to win them. And finally, the final thing is that we are to reach out to all people. And this is verse 22 and verse 23. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessings. So he has love for the person that he has to do with, whether he's similar to him or different to him, but he shows uncompromising love. Why? For the sake of the gospel. So the question for us is, as we church plant, we know ourselves maybe, do we find ease in reaching those who are like us? Do we do it? What about those who are unlike you, come from a completely different background and have a different language completely? Are we doing all we can to reach all people with the gospel in an uncompromising way? So how do you know people? Let me finish with 3 suggestions. How do you get to know people? First of all, you need to see them with gospel eyes. Now, I want you to think about this. This is just a kind of a very simple statement. But the way you look at people, the way you interact and engage with people, it changes radically when you see them through the lens of the gospel. Because you don't see them just as sort of self-sufficient, self-assured, people who've got their act together. You see them the way they actually are in the eyes of God. And that's why the way Jesus looks at the people is so crucial. He looks at them, sees the way they are, helpless and harassed like sheep without a shepherd. As you look out to the people of your city, of your context, do you see them with gospel eyes, or do you see them as a project? I want a church full of people. But gospel eyes, there's that sense of desire that those people might discover the liberating experience of knowing Jesus. Secondly, you put on Christ. Now, this is not something complicated, but I have found personally that this changes your perspective completely. When you're engaging with people, especially the people who are hard and difficult and you wouldn't have chosen, and that frustrate you and that annoy you, But when you look at them with gospel eyes, and when you look at them through the lens of Christ, in other words, you put Christ on. He left his glory. He took on, it's interesting, he became as a man. In the flesh, he was a man. And there was this kind of sense of identifying completely. He gave. He didn't sort of give with a limit. He gave without limit. He gave everything that he had, all that he had, to the point of being completely abandoned at the end of his life. And so how can we put on Christ in our church planting as we know people? What does it mean to know people through the eyes of Jesus? How can we put on Christ in engaging with people? And finally, you do all things to win them. Now this, let me say, requires a lot of energy and time. And it requires full commitment. This is not just your kind of pet project on the weekends when you kind of do an hour and that's it, I've engaged with people. This is pouring your life. If you want to know people, you've got to pour your life into them. As Paul said in Thessalonians, you need to give not just the gospel. I'd say for me that's already plenty. Just give the gospel. But he said, I want to give the gospel, but I want to give you my whole very life. And so that is the challenge for us in knowing people. How well do we know the way they think? Again, this is going to be very practical. How well do we know the way they think? What are they thinking about? What are their values? What are they looking for in life? In that particular context and culture, what are the things that make them tick? How much are we aware of what they're looking at, what they're thinking about? What are their dreams? What are their fears? In other words, let's get to know them. Let's engage with them. And again, looking at context tomorrow, we'll look more at that. But once we have an understanding of who they are, we need to have gospel eyes, compassion. It annoys me so much, the way some people are. In Palermo, they have this habit of honking their horns at every opportunity, and I don't know why. It creates a sense of frustration. Why are you honking your horn? Can't you just be intelligent like me and not do that? And it's like it irritates me. And so we need to go back to looking at people as not horn honkers, but we need to see them as lost people who are looking for significance, and they express it that way, which is frustrating, but that's the way it is. But gospel eyes, Christ, and doing all things to win them, even putting up with horn honking. So I pray that God might help us to look at people in a different way.